Today is August 14th, 2022. That marks the 4th anniversary of when I started making Krunker maps. I've released a total of 20 parkour maps to date, along with several other non-parkour maps, and all I can say is what a ride it has been. I remember back in the day, I was a recent high school graduate preparing to start my college career. I had discovered Krunker a few months previous, and I've been playing it religiously up until early August, where at the time a new update came out that lets you publish custom maps, including parkour maps, which piqued my interest to say the least. Most of the very first parkour maps were fairly primitive. I made a video about some of them if any of you remember, right? I remember playing, I think, easy parkour as well as super parkour. Even though I enjoyed them at the time, it was very much the stone age of Krunker map making. That was until I discovered Parkour Ruins by a tourist, which for the time had absolutely insane amounts of detail. Not only did it blow pretty much everything else I played at the time out of the water, but it was what proved to me that you could actually make some legit stuff in a map editor. And that was ultimately what gave me that first spark to start making maps of my own. So on August 12th, 2018, I got to work on what would become Heavenbound, my first ever parkour map for Krunker. As someone who's played the game since release, up until you know when, I have to stress just how different Krunker was back then, particularly in the map making department. The map editor was, in a word, primitive. Instead of the map editor we know and love today, which looks like a straight up game engine, the editor back in 2018, 2019, even early 2020 was this default 3.js looking template. You had all the very limited tools on the side here, and they were as basic as they come. Literally just cubes, ramps, score zones, and a few of the built-in models like crates, barrels, noob cars. There's object config, which is just a simplified object panel, and the map config, which is the environment panel. There were no checkpoints, there were no multi-point score zones, so you had to have like 5 or however many score zones in the same place if you wanted to have one. There wasn't an emissive color option, you couldn't duplicate or even group objects. All of this is to say is that you had to get pretty creative with how you made maps back in the day. Coupled with the fact that at the time the ability to publish maps was literally only a few weeks old, and you had a situation where no one really knew what they were doing. So aside from the aforementioned Parkour Ruins map, I had nothing really to go off of, so I just did whatever at first. The very first thing I made in the Krunker editor was this little courtyard spawn area with the Heavenbound trees on the left, not even the ones on the right, the central structure, and a huge black plain that resembled a bottomless pit, which would later become the water that's in the final version. From there, I'd build the rest of the spawn area and the sort of castle thing surrounding it, piece by piece, not really thinking about what I actually wanted the map to be, and I'd keep at it for the rest of the day on August 12th, and I picked it up at noon on August 13th, and by afternoon that day, I had finished an early version of the Curvy Tower, right, the centerpiece of the map, the landmark, so to speak. It is also an example of one of the biggest mistakes one can make in a Krunker editor. Rotating collidable objects. You see, whenever you rotated an object, the visible mesh of the object rotated, but the collision box didn't rotate. So while I initially planned for players to actually jump up these little spaces on blocks, they ended up having to wall surf climb the tower instead, so like just holding against it and then jumping up. Of course now with complex collisions you can do that just fine, but you didn't have that option back then, so yeah. Funnily enough, I actually had plans to make the top of this curvy tower the way forward at first, but then I decided against it not too long after. And then as I began to test what I had of the map, I learned that the Heavenbound trees could be climbed up like this, and you could get up here. And this sort of gave me the idea of implementing secrets in the map, which obviously evolved into what Heavenbound would ultimately become. It starts simple with 2 little secret score zones on the tops of the 2 tallest trees. From there, I'd start to implement secret paths, secret points, a little bonus area with some construction stuff, and a tree that's at the end of a boost ramp, some additional details and tweaks, and by the end of the day on August 13th, I had practically finished the map. The next day, August 14th, I made some last minute changes. I believe the no turning back boost ramp was the last thing I added to it, and by noon on August 14th, 2018, I was satisfied enough with the map to publish it as Heavenbound. I often forget that this first map Heavenbound literally only took 2 days to make, making it the shortest map development cycle to date. But then again, the stats for this map are rather measly compared to what I'd eventually make, right? 44 score zones, a little over 700 objects, a little bit large and open, but not particularly huge by any means, again, especially compared to what I'd eventually make. At the time, however, this was something that was quite large for Krunker, and it was something I was super proud of. I remember hosting the first lobby I ever hosted of Heavenbound, that is to say, the first lobby I've ever hosted, ever. The first guy to join was a guest, right, guest 1, who walked up past the red carpet, into the map proper, looked up at the big curvy tower and all the map in front of him, then asked me if I had a life. And my answer to that was, apparently not, alright? You gotta realize at the time, when I discovered this whole map making thing, I wasn't ever planning on taking it seriously. Like, after all, this was just an IO game at the time. I wasn't taking it too seriously. So it came as kind of a surprise to see so many people at the time play it and say that it was their favorite parkour map at the time. And now that I look back at it, it kind of makes sense, right? It had a strong aesthetic at the time, alright? It's literally just wall textures now, but back then it was cool. It was huge, it had cool secrets to find, it had a strong sense of denial and reward over the curvy tower. It was difficult at points. Yeah, it also came out at the perfect time, as no one ever really made a map like it, and I could imagine people being blown away by it. Heavenbound would eventually grow to become one of the most upvoted maps at the time, and it has been kind of forgotten since then, as most maps of the era tend to have been. But back then, not to pat myself in the back, but it was the shit. I remember walking to class, because August 14th was the last day I had before my first day of college on the 15th, and I remember walking to class on that first day, literally checking my shitty Android phone while I was walking, nearly getting hit by a car on the process. Right, trying to check up on how many upvotes I was getting. And I'd see the map get up to well over 300 in no time, which was absolutely crazy to me. So I eventually wanted to update it to make it a little better. Unfortunately, I ran into a little roadblock when I went to do this. And if you watch some of my older videos, specifically the one I mentioned, about the oldest maps on Krunker, you'll know that the original 44-point version of Heavenbound that I initially published on August 14th is missing. Which is ironic, right? It's super funny how I managed to keep all the development versions of Heavenbound, and literally every single version of every map I'd ever make ever since then, but the literal OG map file, literally the most important one in my entire career, is the one file I happened to lose. Alright, I mentioned this. I made Heavenbound on this old desktop, and making Heavenbound was the last thing I ever did on that desktop before I upgraded to a much better computer for college. And while I still have the computer, and it's presumably still on there, the file, I haven't been able to get to it since I don't have a proper monitor to hook up to it anymore. And God only knows if the thing will even turn on at this point. As such, I had to remake that no turning back ramp before I did any updates. And I had to recreate this little boost ramp here, and I had to re-add another score zone and get it back to where it was before. But once I got past that, I managed to get the total point counter up to 50, adding like 5 more secret points before it was all said and done. And with this 50-point version of the map, the final form at the time, I'd argue that this is probably one of my favorites of all my maps to date, because it's just pure experimentation. And I mean, it's not the best age design out there, right? There are no checkpoints. Again, even though the map is kind of designed around having no checkpoints, there's still no checkpoints, so it's kind of annoying. There are some awkward jumps, some weird design choices with bonus area granting more points than the literal most iconic part of the map. But even then, considering that this was literally the first map I've ever made in a map editor, it's quite nice, right? It's a decent enough length to be fun without wasting too much time, and getting to the top of that curving tower and looking down at the whole map, watching everyone else struggle, it made you feel like a god, right? And that sort of coincides with the heaven and the Heavenbound, And I still have yet to really make something like it ever again. And then I had to ruin it. If you were to try and play Heavenbound now, or prior to this video at least, you would have noticed that it looks quite different from what I've been showing so far. Right? It has some background geometry, whereas the original took place back on a single plane of water. The tree in the bonus area went through a bunch of seasons throughout the years before landing on some surreal summer aesthetic, and now in the bonus area, on top of all the construction stuff, whatever you call them, it now has relics of all my other maps in it, all the way up to Starburst. But most importantly, there are now 70 points in the map as opposed to 50, and most of those points were chucked into some of these background areas near the start of the map. And I never really explained the structure of this map in detail, right? There are 3 main parts to Heavenbound, alright? You have the spawn area, the gateway, so to speak, where you could explore and find secrets and get familiar with the map and, dick around without losing too much progress. Then you had the, it's not exactly a stairway, maybe a path to heaven. That was the main challenge of the map. That was the nerve-wracking part, where you could fall and you could go back to the beginning, and it was kind of stressful. And that would lead you to heaven proper, which was like this cool place higher than everything else, and it made you feel good for getting to it, especially at the top of the Kirby Tower, as I mentioned. The cool thing about this map, and it's actually something I sort of had in mind as I was making it at first, if you plan things out beforehand, you could possibly get every single point in this map without dying, as I've demonstrated in what became the most viewed video on my channel. And all these parts sort of played into the whole perfectly without wasting too much time, making it so that it was a daunting, albeit controlled and rewarding experience to make a deathless run of it. But with this buffed up version of Heavenbound that came in around March 2019, so like half a year after it was released, after I created the original 6, yeah, you could still do it, as also demonstrated in yet another video, but it takes much longer now, and it feels more like a chore instead of a fun little challenge. And the reason why this is the case is that a lot of the extra 20 points were added all in this starting area, alright? There are these 2, islands that are off to the sides and behind the starting area that I decided to add ways to get to and add all these extra points to go to there. And it just made this first area especially a pain in the butt to get through, alright? Especially this part off to the side. You have to basically go up this ladder all the way at the back, climb up these pillars, and land down amongst the trees where there are points hiding in various places. And if you fall off the trees, you need to go all the way back up this ladder at the back of the area, climb up the pillars, and do it again. And you're gonna do it over and over and over again because there are like a ton of new points in the trees and you can't get them all at once. All of the backtracking you have to do, not just here but throughout. Yeah, it was a thing in the original, but you really only had to do it a little bit. And that was really only if you were trying to do a deathless run. But with this update, you're basically spending 80% of the time on this map going through this spawn area and the islands around it over and over and over and over again. And let me tell you, it wears out really fast. Not to mention just random bonus points I added in various different random locations. And not to mention the 3rd anniversary of the map, where I shoehorned in these little knifeable bonuses into the map, where if you knife them all, you can access an abandoned map that I had in the works right after I made Heavenbound. Which was cool, I guess, but again, it messed with the flow of the map because you had to backtrack and search all over, like literally every inch of the entire map, just to get everything, and it added even more things that you had to do, alright? There's no other way to put it. New Heavenbound was bloated as fuck. Alright, now I did for archival purposes publish the 50-point version of Heavenbound as old Heavenbound so that I would completely screw up the map's legacy, but still, Heavenbound was no longer a short and sweet little map that made you feel like a god, alright? Heavenbound was modernized in the worst way possible, when it really didn't need to be modernized. And a little bit of backstory on how this even came to be, someone who I knew from the map making scene wanted to make a remaster of the map or something. So I gave them the map file, and they made the whole background layout thing here that you're seeing. Like, this was his proposal, and he suggested that I should update Heavenbound myself with it. Which I should have said no, but I was trying to appease him, I guess. I don't know what I was thinking. And so I decided to add on all this shit to it, and now we have this mess, which, it's fine, alright? If I were to rank it on like a tier list, it'd be like a C tier or something, and the original Heavenbound would be like a B tier, maybe even an A tier. Because, I mean, I've kept the original design structure mostly intact, and the old map is still there somewhat, but as I've explained, it's a shell of what it once was. And I kind of hate myself for doing it this way, so now that it's the 4th anniversary of this map, I feel like making this right. So, this is what I've done. I've republished the quote-unquote modernized Heavenbound as Heavenbound Pro Max, if you really want to play with it. I then took the 50-point version of Heavenbound, I actually properly modernized it while keeping the full original map intact, alright? I didn't add any points to it or anything. I just gave quality of life changes and did some stuff, and I published that as the main Heavenbound, like just Heavenbound. And as for old Heavenbound, if or when I find the original 44-point version of the map, I'm gonna update old Heavenbound with that. But for now, it's just a 45-point version. And yeah, if you want to play Heavenbound, check it out. Whatever version you want to play. I guess to summarize it, as outdated as design may be and as misguided as the big update was, it's still a very special and important map in my map making career that I don't think I could fully replicate again.